This video is sponsored by Rant. Oi. I've been trying to get this video made for literally months, and I know, I've been gone a while. If you're curious what I've been doing during that time, well... Yeah, I'm really good at Fortnite, apparently. Anyway, ever since I was a little boy, I've noticed the divide between the life that I had, the capacity and freedom I had to live, and the lives of my white male peers and colleagues. And while it's not always malicious, I can't help but acknowledge the role that privilege plays in our decision-making process. We have to consider consequences of our actions. We have to think about the environmental and societal impact of the things that we say and do. Well, some of us do. Some people get to do whatever they please, and will get noticeably angry with you if you ever suggest otherwise. Don't get me wrong, confidence and tenacity is good. But some men develop such a massive misconception of freedom and autonomy that they can fail to acknowledge whether or not they should take an action, in addition to if they can take said action. So I'm going to rant about this, and to get my point across, I'm going to absolutely trash a popular biography that I absolutely can't stand. So, in 1992, a college-educated white male from a wealthy family operating under the nickname Alexander Supertramp hitchhiked all the way from South Dakota to central Alaska. Once there, driven by his desire to leave civilization behind and return to nature, he was dropped off near the base of the Denali mountain range and wandered off into the wilderness. The last driver who gave him a ride recognized that Mr. Supertramp was not prepared to survive his intended journey, to the point that he literally offered to drive the dude to town and purchase him proper supplies, a request he declined repeatedly. Must be nice to be white and have people constantly offering to bend over backwards to course correct you away from your own self-destructive path. A few months later, his miserable corpse would be found decomposing in an abandoned bus, and given his observed lack of planning, training, supplies, or general sense of self-preservation, this seemed to be the inevitable outcome. Oh, his actual name was Chris McCandless. There was a 9,000-word article, and then a Sean Penn movie, then a book, all dedicated to this delusional, overconfident, melanin-deficient bonehead. To be so careless, to show such wanton disregard for one's own well-being, to act on impulse so recklessly and without foresight or planning, to be so dense as to ignore countless warnings and offers of assistance. That, my friends, can only come from a place of privilege. To be specific, white privilege. To be painfully specific, white male privilege. Hit it. I first heard about the Chris McCandless story when I was a kid in elementary school. Later, in junior high, I'd see a friend reading the book, and I was inquisitive. So I learned more about him and his journey at that time. Over the years, the story would regain popularity as the nonfiction book would be dramatized for film. I believe there was also a documentary shot. And I just can't help but ask, why? Why are we lionizing this man? When I began to learn more about this story, I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy or empathy with McCandless. I found myself wondering why yet another white guy with a death wish was garnering any kind of media attention. While many know about his fate in Alaska, the events leading up to his arrival at the Denali are glossed over or treated as an afterthought. So given that there is no shortage of sympathy and overly dramatized accounts of his short adult life, I'm going to give a more sterile, critical, and uncharitable summary. And to save time when repeating myself, I'm just going to run a privilege counter at the bottom of the screen. Privilege. And for those of you keeping track at home, every time you see that counter go up, just ask yourself if the current situation is a privilege that you could benefit from. All right, let's begin. McCandless graduated from Emory University with a bachelor's degree in double majors of history and anthropology. Emory University is a prestigious and expensive private college in Georgia, whose faculty has included the likes of Desmond Tutu, Bernice King, Jimmy Carter, the 14th freaking Dalai Lama, and Newt Gingrich. They can't all be winners. Imagine having to be taught by the Dalai Lama. I wonder how many of his lectures were peppered with Falun Gong propaganda. Google it. Somehow, he completed his bachelor's program with a savings of $24,000, which he donated to Oxfam. Must be nice to be able to finish any kind of post-secondary education, not only without any debt, but with a positive balance in your bank account. Privilege. What did this, by all accounts, honor student do with this college-level education in history and anthropology, not to mention the networking connections from such a renowned institution to better society? He opted to give away his money and possessions and become a vagabond. He worked when he needed to as a food preparer or farmhand, and often went tramping or undertaking days-long walks and hikes in the wilderness. That's where his nickname, Alexander Supertramp, came from. At one point, he attempted to drive his beat-up car across the country to California. He did so with no insurance and expired plates. I wonder if I could drive across multiple jurisdictions and state lines for multiple days without insurance or valid plates and have no fear of running afoul of law enforcement or what they might do when they encounter me. Privilege. He would later let his car get caught in flash flooding, which would damage it beyond repair, so he abandoned it after taking the license plates and his belongings and striking out on foot. And yet his car was still identified, given that we can tell this story now 30 years later. However, I don't recall reading about him facing any consequences for leaving a derelict vehicle to be handled by the taxpayers. He certainly didn't seem too worried about it either. Privilege. Hey, you want to know something funny in a brief intermission? You know what happened to his Datsun? Yeah, his old car, his old hoopty basically got picked up by the local police department, and they rehabbed it and repaired it and used it as an unmarked vehicle for their detectives. Yeah, and for undercover stings. Crazy, right? At one point, he would hitchhike to the Sierra Nevada mountains and survive by breaking into cabins and stealing food and money and supplies. Clearly, he had to steal, you see, to survive the situation he completely willingly put himself into and could escape any time with one phone call. Obviously, he didn't fear any repercussions either from those actions. During another excursion, he would quit his job again and purchase a gun, because America, and he would also purchase a canoe to navigate the Colorado River. You actually need a permit from local authorities to navigate the river by canoe, and there are many extremely treacherous areas of the river with dangerous rapids that people are prohibited from navigating. So naturally, old Supertramp took his canoe down the river illegally, not bothering with a permit, and was spotted by multiple people going through very dangerous sections of the river without any safety equipment. This, of course, got the attention of the authorities, who began pursuing him, possibly to issue a citation, or possibly to keep this guy from becoming a future corpse retrieval expedition at taxpayer expense. And he continued to run from the authorities, making him a fugitive. Now, on the run from the cops, showing a rare moment of fear of consequences, he followed the river all the way down to the Mexican border and sold his canoe. Then he crossed into Mexico without a passport. He stayed in Mexico for a while, but what do you know? The white boy who wanted to strike out on his own and see the world rapidly found himself in over his head. Supposedly, he got very scared by the amount of crime over in northern Mexico, so he illegally crossed back into the United States without a passport while carrying a firearm, also illegally, and he was stopped at the border briefly and arrested. Ultimately, they just confiscated his weapon and let him go. And doesn't this just give a new light to how other people are treated when crossing the border?
The overhead lighting in the warehouse stays on around the clock.
Yeah. Privilege. The next year, he would go on to take his final journey in Alaska. Ultimately, while he was up there, he would camp out in an old abandoned bus in the mountain range. And despite the fact that at any given time he was less than a mile away from rescue, his insistence on going out there without a map, without a compass, or without any means to navigate meant that after the river that he crossed to get where he was got too high for him to cross back, he was basically stranded. But of course, if he had a map, he would have known that there was a manual trolley bridge less than a mile south of his location, and that a couple miles north of him, There was an inhabited lodge that he easily could have found food and shelter at. Well, I feel like I should be able to get one more tick on the counter for privilege. Let me think. Oh yeah, he illegally poached and killed a moose while living in the wild in Alaska, saw no consequences for that, and just turned around and let the meat spoil. Because seriously, this guy is just the worst. Privilege. Ultimately, though, he would go on to die. It's up for debate how he died. It could have been due to malnutrition, brought about by a disease from eating too much small game, like rabbits and chipmunks and stuff, or it could have been from poison berries. A lot of people go back and forth over his cause of death quite a bit. What can we take away from this character study? For one thing, Chris McCandless never stopped and thought about what could happen as a consequence of his actions. And looking over his life story, there's a very clear pattern of him putting himself in danger, or breaking laws, or purposefully leaving the relative safety and security of civilization with the assumption that there would be someone there, willing to inconvenience themselves to help him out of a jam. Just the thought of a random stranger pulling over to give someone that looks like me a ride is laughable. While he didn't hesitate to sneak across the Mexican border with the confidence that he could return any time he liked, and didn't even have any misgivings about doing so while carrying a gun and not having a passport. And many times he was right. They just let him go without charges at the U.S. border. He never saw any consequences for stealing from cabins in the Sierra Nevada region. The guy who gave him his last ride in Alaska offered to go spend hundreds of dollars to buy him outdoors equipment, and when McCandless declined, he still gave him all the food he had with him, as well as some extra tough brand boots for his trip. Boots, I should let you know, cost at least $100. Now, one of the last things McCandless did before dying was pen an SOS letter on the outside of the bus he was sleeping in, asking for someone to save his life. Whenever I look at that letter, I just hear in my head, "Help, I'm white and I got in over my head, now please rescue me." Perhaps that's too mean. But my whole life I've seen this pattern among people who have so little to worry about in their day-to-day lives that they will go out of their way to seek out danger. Chris McCandless isn't the only deluded white dude to suffer such a fate. Timothy Treadwell was another young guy who wanted to commune with nature and made some positively blockheaded decisions, ultimately ending with him and his girlfriend being torn to shreds by the grizzly bears he so loved. And of course, this happened because he regularly ignored the warnings and acted with the confidence of someone who has no fear of consequences. I'd mentioned at the beginning that I have been attempting to get this video out for some time. What normally happens is a big news story breaks, and there's a great deal of discourse about a given topic, in this case, let's say the Rittenhouse trial. Me, wanting to take the opportunity to speak on some systemic issues related to the current discourse, decide to start hammering out a script. But then I am reminded of my crippling ADHD and absolutely terrible workflow, and ultimately I fail to get the raw footage shot in a timely fashion, and the subject slips out of the public discourse. This particular topic, however, has stuck with me for months, and that is due to the fact that we get a pretty sickening public display of white privilege pretty much every other week at this point. So the Ahmaud Arbery case takes over the news cycle, and once again I am poised to record a topical and concise discussion on the subject. And of course, again, I procrastinate until that subject has faded from the public forum. And yet, not to be outdone, angry white boys rear their ugly heads once more with the trucker convoy. Imagine that, a highly contagious illness that was killing the equivalent of 9/11 every day during its peak isn't justification enough for a bunch of angry hobgoblins drunk off of diesel fumes to mildly inconvenience themselves a bit and wear a mask. No, instead they're going to block roads and protest. What exactly were they protesting? Like, wasn't it already established that there wasn't going to be any federal mask or vaccine mandates? I guess just being white and angry was justification enough to take to the streets. Several massive and overwhelmingly peaceful demonstrations took place in 2020 over the very real and very justified anger and frustration with police brutality, and progressives are being accused to this day of burning down cities. You know, I've seen another example of this play out right here on YouTube. Dear friend of the channel and anarcho-furry trans musical icon Patricia Taxon turned me onto the JCS Criminal Psychology channel. It's a true crime analysis channel that mainly focuses on police interrogations. I should add that despite how mean-spirited and petty this video has come off up to this point, I don't mean any ill will towards JCS. So, don't be terrible. I think it's pretty clear that the sort of privilege I've been talking about can be showcased unintentionally. After all, being blind to biases is in and of itself a privilege. Oh, and I should add that this next section can be a bit upsetting, as it will involve some tragic racism-fueled violence. Skip to the timestamp on the screen right now if you want to avoid that. Anyway, a couple particular cases stuck out to me. In the Drejka case, a Caucasian male pulls into the parking lot of a convenience store, and upon seeing a black woman and her child sitting as passengers in a car parked in a handicapped parking spot, he immediately saw that it was his civic duty to politely remind them that the handicapped parking spaces were for disabled patrons. He then went inside and bought her kids some ice cream and left the store to go to choir practice, and I'm just kidding. Of course I'm kidding. This is a confident white male. He got out of his car and immediately started loudly hurling vulgarities and insults at a black woman in her car with her child while stalking around the parked vehicle. Her husband, a black man named Marquise, was in the convenience store making his purchase. He overheard the shouting outside and exited the establishment before walking up to Drejka and pushing him to the ground. Drejka calmly sat up and drew his firearm. Surveillance footage clearly shows Marquise slowly backing away from Drejka at the sight of the firearm. Drejka then allowed a whole 2 seconds to pass before discharging his weapon into Marquise's chest, fatally wounding him. In the interrogation, Drejka would admit that he was an aspiring cop and just really wanted people to follow the rules when it comes to handicapped parking. He also admitted that he was not a fighter but carried a firearm to ensure a deadly outcome to any encounter he instigated. Pretty ugly case. Also pretty textbook case of white privilege. Right now, though, I want to focus on the JCS analysis of the interrogation. JCS gives an albeit dry, but well-informed play-by-play commentary of the recorded interrogation. But if you watch the entire video, which, if you can stomach it, I definitely encourage you to do so, it almost feels as if JCS goes out of his way to ignore the enormous racist elephant in the room. He will point out that Drejka's defense of his actions during interrogation would suggest that he felt justified using lethal force in an altercation while completely disregarding the life of the other individual, even if lethal force wasn't necessary. JCS even goes so far as to point out that near the end, Drejka had a history of threatening people on the side of a road with a firearm, including a mother with children. But can you talk about such brazenly aggro behavior without addressing the fact that this wannabe cop felt so empowered by his white male privilege that he had no reservations whatsoever about getting out of his car to accost a black mother with her children, and then executing her husband in a parking lot while his life was demonstrably not in danger? There's another case on the channel that I'll avoid going into too much detail about given the extremely upsetting nature of the events. But to summarize, the Michael Dunn case involves a guy who got tipsy at a wedding reception with his wife, decided to stop at a convenience store where some black youth in an adjacent vehicle were playing loud music, and decided to stay in the car in a complete beta move and sent his wife into the store to go buy them some wine because, well, you know what, let's let him tell it in his own words.
When you pulled up, was there an open spot to the right of the red Dodge Durango?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
Tell these jurors why you didn't pull into that empty spot next to the sidewalk.
I heard the loud music. Didn't want to deal with it.
Yeah, didn't want to deal with it. Long story short, he started shouting at the kids in the other vehicle who were just waiting for the friend to exit the store, before he would ultimately begin discharging rounds into the side of their vehicle, fatally wounding one of the 4 occupants. Now, JCS goes so far as to point out that this guy's actions were probably racially motivated. Very good. But again, we have a very dry and matter-of-fact summary of the interrogation, taking time to expand upon the legal precedents set by his account of events. And yet again, we see him completely gloss over the very real and very pervasive system that would enable someone to unload on the side of a car and then casually return to his hotel, walk his dog, and relax. White supremacy gave this man the confidence to commit this horrible act, and white supremacy is the system that gave Drejka the confidence to think that he could kill a black man in cold blood, calmly wait for the police to arrive, and sit back and wait for the system to absolve him of any wrongdoing. And it shows an amount of privilege that someone can be so blind to their own biases that they can go over these cases and interrogations ad nauseum without the systemic ill of white supremacy warranting a mention. Gosh, what was I talking about before this tangent? Something about a guy in Alaska? Man, this video has gone off the rails. Look, I don't want it to seem like I'm just harping on this McCandless kid just for being a disaffected youth. With the current state of things, I can totally understand if you have a desire to just run off into the woods and escape this ever-present pending sense of doom, especially if you think too long and hard about the looming climate crisis. But we are anarchists. The Beat generation is long gone, Kerouac was pretentious and overrated, we value action. Running off into the forest will accomplish nothing, and at some point you won't be able to escape the coming disaster. The good news is you can have hope, and if you don't know where to start when it comes to making real substantive change, resources like the sponsor of this video might be a good place to start. Rant is a website with a variety of tools available to help you at the individual level take part in a global initiative to fight the worst effects of climate change. They have tools that can allow you to do things like calculate your carbon footprint, how to reduce it, and how to offset the remaining footprint by funding carbon reduction projects like tree planting, mineral weathering, and rainforest protection. When you sign up to make a monthly contribution to offset your carbon footprint, you get monthly updates about the projects you are funding. They clearly detail what your money is going towards, complete with photos and details on every tree planted, every acre reforested, and every ton of carbon offset. Now, I love fried food. I think you know I love fried food. Cooking and eating is something very near and dear to me. My current favorite project that Rant is supporting is a drive to provide clean cooking fuel for refugees in Uganda. As a lover of food and humanity, I can tell you that there is truly nothing more human than sitting down with someone and breaking bread with them. Rant is feeding 1 million people and saving thousands of acres from deforestation every year. And you have the opportunity to help out as well. Offset your carbon footprint on Rant. The first 100 people to sign up using the link in the description will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. Thank you to Rant for sponsoring this video. But I'm not just talking about Kyle Rittenhouse, am I? I could be talking about Elliot Rodger. I could be talking about James Holmes or Patrick Crusius. People of all ethnicities commit crimes, and people of all ethnicities take actions that aren't very well thought out. So perhaps this is anecdotal. Maybe it's purely dependent on environmental factors exclusive to me and my background. But out of 14 million timelines, there's not a single one where I feel bold enough to walk around with a rifle slung over my shoulder in an active riot zone, kill some folks at a place I didn't need to be, and then expect that I will continue to be a living, breathing, free man. I've never had that delusion because I have always known that there are two justice systems in this country. And recent court cases have made it clear that the melanin deficient among us don't have this same apprehension. The killers of Ahmaud Arbery were found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. Not going to talk about the court case or the legal precedent set today. Instead, I want to ask a question. Why did they feel justified in doing that? Why did they feel so bold in their actions that they could, without hesitation, chase down and murder a man, solely for committing the crime of existing in the wrong neighborhood? And the more important question, what does that say about our justice system, or whatever you could call the farce pretending to be a justice system, that they didn't have any fear of reprisal? I was raised to do everything in my power to avoid any and all trouble in public, always behave myself, never have emotional outbursts, because I have parents that lived through the civil rights movement and they know firsthand what happens to large black men when the police arrive. What happened to living in a society? What happened to the social contract? What happened to decency towards your fellow man? We need to address the conditions that lead to white men feeling so confident in their destructive actions before we can ever move forward. Also, another thing, if you've watched this and you take issue with my pointing out the race of the individuals that I've referenced, or you want to pull that lib crap take that I'm being racist by pointing out white privilege, please save yourself the embarrassment and spare me the stupid comments, or we will all take turns eviscerating you as I share your stupid comments with my friends. And we'll have several rounds of laughing at your ignorance. If you pretend that white privilege doesn't exist, then you're a little racist. Just a little bit. No other way to put it. Black mothers are 3 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women. Black women are overrepresented among college students, and yet black students disproportionately carry more student loan debt than their white counterparts. Black men are more likely to be pulled over by the police than white men. Black men are more likely to be subjected to the use of force by police than white men, even accounting for all variables. Black patients are more likely to have their pain ignored by medical staff. Black neighborhoods have less access to fresh produce and lean meats. Black neighborhoods have less access to birth control and family planning services. Black neighborhoods have less access to mental health services. Black families have a fraction of a percent of the generational wealth of their white peers. Black residents in black neighborhoods have historically had less approval for home loans. Black job applicants with a black-sounding name are less likely to be called back for interviews. Lots of experience with that one personally, by the way. And everything I just listed is backed by empirical data. If after all of that, and listening to me rant about some fatally stupid fail-son, you still want to act like I'm the one being racist for pointing out that white privilege exists where it does, then no amount of debating or video essays or tweeting is going to make the difference. You best just stay quiet and stay out of the way. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to click like and subscribe, and click the little bell for more videos. Oh, and share in the comments any other overrated stories about recklessly entitled white men. And be sure to follow me on Twitter, where I share my favorite vegan recipes. And if you're so inclined to support the channel, consider checking out my Patreon. Thanks again.